So in this video, let's talk about the aggregate demand shifters in a little detail. Okay, so I said that these are the factors that can actually lead to an increase or decrease in the aggregate demand and hence cause a shift of the aggregate demand curve with no change in the price index. That means the price index staying constant. Now anything that leads to an increase in the aggregate demand, if your aggregate demand goes up at a constant price index, then that would cause a right shift of the AD curve, and anything that leads to a decrease in the aggregate demand with the price index staying constant would cause a left shift of the AD curve. Please note that this is no different than your ordinary demand curve which we have covered in module 2. Even for your ordinary demand you had this, if demand goes up it's a right shift, if demand goes down it's a left shift. So the same also holds for aggregate demand. However, the factors causing the shift are very different because now we are on the macroeconomy, we are no longer in the microeconomy. Now what is the interest rate effect? And like I said, this is the most important one. Now here we are assuming that there is just one interest rate in the economy and that interest rate is denoted by small r. Okay, it is denoted by small r. Please note that if small r goes up, if the rate of interest in the economy goes up, then two things happen in the economy. Please understand. If the rate of interest in the economy goes up, then two things can happen in the economy. The direct impact of an increase in the rate of interest is that business firms now do not have incentive to take loans, right? Because if they take loans, they have to pay back higher interest to the lending institution, to the bank. So they have a disincentive for taking loans, isn't it? Taking loans has become costlier. So what would you see? If they do not take loans, then the business firms are able to make less investments. So a direct impact is a decrease in investment. As soon as the rate of interest goes up, the investment spending of the economy goes down. Also, there is another impact. Since the rate of interest is going up, this is also the rate of interest that you get when you invest your money. As a household, you keep your money in the savings account, or you buy the stocks of a company, or you buy any certificate deposit. So this is also the return that you get when you make investments as a household, when you save as a household, right? So if you are getting a higher return, then as a household member, you will have higher incentive to save your money, isn't it? Because you can now get higher return if you invest or save your money. So you will put more money into savings, and that means you will have less money for consumption purposes. You will have lower amount of money dedicated for consumption of goods and services because you are putting away more money into savings because you see the prospect of earning higher return. So besides lower investment, you also see lower spending by the household. So your consumption spending is going to be lower, isn't it? And these two together is going to lead to a decrease in the total expenditure of the economy, because remember your total expenditure was C plus I plus G plus NX. So everything staying the same, if I and C go down, then total expenditure goes down, and as a result of that your aggregate demand goes down, and as a result of that your real GDP goes down. Okay, but please note that this decrease in aggregate demand is going to be reflected by a left shift of the aggregate demand curve, a left shift. What are we talking about? Let's draw a diagram right here. And for lack of space, I'm drawing a small diagram, but hopefully you understand. Okay, that's your GDP deflator, that's your aggregate demand. Okay, it's your aggregate demand AD curve. So we are saying that there is no change in the price index. Price index is constant at P bar, but because your rate of interest went up, that's why you see a decrease in your AD, which means you see a left shift of that curve to something like AD dash, and as a result of that your real GDP is actually going down. That's what we are saying. Okay. Now the opposite would happen if the rate of interest went down, opposite would happen, isn't it? That is still called interest rate effect. So if your rate of interest went down, then obviously business firms would take more loans. It is easier for them to take loans, so investment would be higher. The households are not interested in saving. They don't care about that low return, so they don't want to save. They rather consume. So the consumption would be high. The total expenditure would be high. The aggregate demand would be high, and the real GDP of the economy would be high, and that increase in aggregate demand would be reflected by this rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve to something like AD double dash. Okay, so that's what we are saying. It's similar to your module 2, just the factors, the shifters are different, okay, but in how it impacts the diagram is still the same. Now let's talk about the foreign income effect. The foreign income effect is yet another shifter of the aggregate demand curve. Now, if the income in a foreign country goes up, how will that impact your economy? Please note, what has happened is an increase in income in a foreign land. Maybe there has been increase in income in Japan or in India or in China, right? There is no inflation or deflation in my country, but the increase in income of foreigners sitting in another country, how would that impact me, my country, right? What would happen? Those foreigners have now become, they have more income, they have more money, so they would be spending that money on more goods and services. They would be buying more goods and services, and as those people buy more goods and services, they not only buy the goods and services that are produced domestically in their own country, but they also buy some of the goods that have gone into their country from United States. In other words, they buy more of the imported goods. People sitting in India, if they have higher income, they go into malls and not only buy the goods that are made in India, but they also end up buying some goods that are made in USA, right? If that happens, then the exports of USA will go up if income in India rises. And as that happens, please note that my net exports, which is basically my X minus M, that net exports is also going to increase. There will be an increase of net exports because the capital X has gone up. And if that happens, then my total expenditure is going to go up, because what is my total expenditure? Remember, my total expenditure was C plus I plus G plus that NX. So if NX goes up, the total expenditure goes up. As a result of that, the aggregate demand goes up and the real GDP goes up. Okay. So once again, you see there is a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right, something like AD double dash, and please note that this entire thing has happened with no inflation or deflation happening in United States to start with. Okay. Now after this impact, there may be inflation or deflation happening as a follow-up, step 2, but initially this is not triggered by inflation or deflation in United States, rather it is triggered by something totally outside in another country. Okay, so that is also an aggregate demand shifter. The opposite would happen if the income in India went down. If the income in a foreign country went down, then you would see the opposite effect and you would see a left shift of the AD curve. Okay. Now, when it comes to consumer expectations, under consumer expectations, we are basically talking about consumers in my country, consumers in USA being optimistic, there being optimism or there being pessimism. What do the consumers feel? What is the general environment among the consumers in a country? Who are the consumers in the country? The consumers in the country are, the major consumers are the household sectors and the business firms. So are the consumers feeling optimistic about the country? Are they feeling positive about the country? Or are they feeling pessimistic, negative, adversely about the country? Now what could really lead to optimism or pessimism? There could be a lot of factors, right? Socio-economic factors. Your country has a lot of, corruption, an unstable government, and there is financial crisis, your banking institutions are failing, your stock market is crashing, your country is going into war, and your government is changing, there is like impeachment of your president maybe, right? All that leads to an environment of negativity among the people, business firms and households, and you have a pessimistic environment in a country. Now in a country that feels pessimistic, people want to save, they do not want to spend because they want to save for the rainy days. They are not sure, they don't feel very positive about the future of the country. So in that kind of an economy, the consumption and the investment tends to be low. So whenever there is pessimism, C is going to be low, I is going to be low, G is also likely going to be low. So your total expenditure is going to be low and your aggregate demand is going to be low in those countries, because those countries tend to save more for rainy days. It is the same thing as you would do in your family, right? Someone in the family gets fired and loses a job, immediately you cut back on your spending, right? You try to go on minimum budget. Same thing for the country. If you don't feel positive about your country, you want to save for the rainy days, spend less. The opposite would happen if there is optimism. When is there optimism in a country? Obviously, if the economy looks good, everything is working well, jobs are being generated, there is a stable government, right? There is a president maybe talking about really stringent immigration laws, and that is making people feel extremely confident and positive. The banking industry is doing good, the stock market is thriving, people feel optimistic, and in those kind of countries, in that kind of environment, people are going to spend and save less. So in such environment, the consumption is going to be high, investment is going to be high, government expenditure is also likely to be high, so that you will see an increase in the aggregate demand. And this is basically reflected through a right shift or a left shift of the aggregate demand curve, because please note that this has been triggered by expectation of the consumers while there has been no inflation or deflation. So it is not driven by the price index in the country. Okay? So these are the factors that really shift the aggregate demand curve. Now when it comes to government policies, we are basically talking about fiscal and monetary policy here, but that is for our discussion in module 4 unit 2. We are going to specifically talk about policies, but one thing for you to remember, I want to plant that germ. Please note that government policies qualify under aggregate demand shifters. So when we move on to the supply side later on, and when we move on to module 4 unit 2, please remember that government policies only affect the demand side of the economy. They really do not have any bearings on the supply side of the economy. They cannot cause any change there. They only cause a shift of the aggregate demand curve. Now before I end this video and move on to the next one where I'm going to talk about aggregate supply, I just want to tell you that any increase in the aggregate demand curve is basically called a positive demand shock, and any decrease in aggregate demand is called a negative demand shock. Okay. Now with that I will end this video. In the next video we will talk about the aggregate supply, and then we are going to bring the two sides together.